Good afternoon. Welcome to the Institute of International Studies Foreign Policy Series. Nice to see familiar faces and new faces as well. My name is Neil Jock. I'm a visiting scholar here at the Institute and the host of this series. Before beginning, I would like to note that we can announce that we've added a final lecture to the series on December 5. Dan Markey from the Council on Foreign Relations will be here. It's a sort of target of opportunity, so we asked him, since he was in town, if he could come and give a talk here as well. So it'll be a Thursday at 2 o'clock in this room. That's on December 5. Dan has just finished a book on Pakistan-U.S. relations called No Exit from Pakistan, and I think will provide us with some very interesting insights. He too has both an academic as well as policy practitioner background. He was at the policy planning staff at the State Department for several years before joining the council. Yes, and the companion series to this on U.S. defense policy will have Richard Meese speaking, Admiral Richard Meese speaking at 4 o'clock the same day. So we planned these to be so they didn't conflict. But he will be speaking on defense policy issues under the Harold Smith seminar series. And that's December 5. Here in this building. Today's guest, Thomas Graham, is a managing director at Kissinger Associates, where he focuses on Russian and Eurasian affairs. He's also a senior fellow at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs at Yale University, where he teaches a capstone seminar on Sino-Russian relations and U.S. national security. Tom was special assistant to the president and senior director for Russia under President George W. Bush on the National Security Council from 2004 to 2007. Prior to that, he was director for Russian affairs on the same staff from 2002 to 2004. So essentially from 2002 throughout the balance of the George W. Bush administration, he was President Bush's senior advisor on Russian issues. From 2001 to 2002, he served on the policy planning staff as the associate director at the Department of State. That's where Tom and I first came to know each other. We worked on a few issues together. I was there on South Asia issues. He was there on Russia and Eurasian issues, Central Asian issues. Prior to joining the State Department from 1998 to 2001, Tom was senior associate on the Russia-Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. From 1984 to 1998, he was a Foreign Service officer. His assignments included 2 tours of duty in Moscow, where he served as head of the political internal unit and acting political counselor. Between tours in Moscow, he worked on Russian and Soviet affairs again at the policy planning staff at the Department of State and as a policy assistant in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Tom had a very early start today at my request. While we were sleeping peacefully at 3 o'clock this morning, he was getting on a flight in Kennedy Airport in New York. So I am very grateful that he was willing to make this long day, and I look forward to his comments. It's a real pleasure to welcome here at Berkeley. The title for his lecture is "Where is Putin Taking Russia? Implications for U.S. Foreign Policy." So please join me in welcoming Tom Graham to Berkeley. Tom.
Probably shouldn't read the introduction again, right?
Depends, if it were some people, it's egos in Washington, they'd want to hear it.
Thank you very much, Neil, for that very, absolutely, a lot more humble. To show you how humble I am, I like to tell people that I'm always surprised that anybody invites me back to talk about Russia, and certainly Russia policy.
Well, we'll see. That's the first time.
I started at the National Security Council staff the weekend after President Bush and President Putin had a big summit meeting in Moscow and St. Petersburg. They flew on to Rome. You might remember back then, this is 2002, to set up the NATO-Russia Council. We issued a joint declaration that laid out a framework for strategic partnership between the two countries. And in many ways, that was the high point of U.S.-Russian relations in the first term, or in the Bush administration. I left the NSC 48 hours before Putin's Munich speech. So if you sort of trace the trajectory of policy on Russia, when I was somewhat responsible for it, started up here, we ended up here. The only thing I can say in self-justification is after I left, it went off the cliff. So I like to say that I wasn't driving Russia policy. I was the brakeman for about 4.5, 5 years. But in any event, what we want to talk about tonight is Russia, and what I want to provide is not so much a down in the weeds view of Putin and his politics, but a broad sort of overview about Russia, how we understand the challenges that Russia faces and where the country might be headed over the next several years. And of course, it's always a pleasure to talk about Russia when Russia's back in the news in a favorable way. So Syria puts Russia back in the center stage of world politics for one of those rare moments since the breakup of the Soviet Union a generation ago. And Russia loves to be on center stage. Russia believes that this is really where Russia belongs. And in this regard, it's important to remember that for the 300 years until 1991, till the emergence of a new Russia, Russia really was a consequential country. Although it was poor and technically backward by European standards, it was the dynamic core of Eurasia. It played a major role in European affairs from 1700 onwards as one of the few major powers. Twice, it drove its troops to the center of Europe, once in 1814, 1815, again in 1944 and 1945, in response to first the strategic blunders of Napoleon and then those of Hitler. And in the 20th century, as the other European powers faded, in exhaustion or defeat out of 2 world wars, Russia emerged as the other superpower in a global competition with the United States. And even seeming failure, you take the collapse of the other regime in 1917, Russia continued to have major world historical importance. The Bolsheviks inspired revolutionary national liberation movements for decades after they seized power in 1917. So, for better or worse, Russia mattered for over 300 years. Now, the decade after the breakup of the Soviet Union wasn't kind to Russia. It was relegated to the margins of international affairs, and not only by the United States. What was remarkable for those of us who participated in international conferences in the 1990s is how little attention was paid to Russia. And that didn't matter whether the conference was held in Europe, Asia, or North America. Russia just didn't matter in global affairs. And Putin, when he came back, takes great pride in saying that he's put an end to that decade of national humiliation. Russia matters again, he insists. And I think the question we need to ask today is whether he's right. There are many people that doubt that the recovery that we've seen over the past decade is sustainable. They look at the upswing and they see it as a mere blip in a downward trajectory to lesser and lesser relevance. Consider this. Almost every key asset that Russia has is a wasting asset. Nuclear weapons may deter, but they're becoming increasingly less important for the projection of power as a new generation of cyber and precision-guided conventional weapons come online. Russia may have an abundance of energy, but the shale revolution in the United States, shale oil, tight gas, is reducing the leverage that Russia once had in European markets where it exports the bulk of its oil and gas. Russian is no longer the lingua franca of the former Soviet space. And that shared sense of statehood, of a common destiny in this region is fading into history. Russia's educational system, particularly in the hard sciences, once at world-class levels, is in decline, as is its population. And so the question you have to ask today is, what is the future of Russian power going to be? So where is Russia headed? Or better, what are the challenges that Russia needs to master if it's going to restore and sustain itself as a country of consequence, as a great power? Now let me begin with a few thoughts about the Russian approach to foreign policy. And I do this because this differs radically from the liberal interventionist and neoconservative approaches that dominate the debate in Washington today. Russia's leaders, including President Putin, adhere to what we would call the realist school of international politics, or what Russians would call the great power school. For them, sovereign states are the central actors in international affairs. Private companies, non-governmental organizations, and other non-state entities are not autonomous actors pursuing their parochial interests. Rather, they are instruments of state power. Sovereign states, by their very nature, engage in competition with other great powers for power and prestige. And in this way, conflict is inevitable. Moreover, conflict is in a sense the essence of global affairs from the Russian standpoint. And in a world of conflict and disharmony, hard power remains the realm, the coin of the realm, even if Russia is building up its soft power at this point. And moreover, for the Russians, everything is connected. The Russians do not like to deal with issues in isolation, or as we say, on their own merits. They take problems and they put them in a broader context, and they try to optimize the outcome from Russia by balancing interests against one another. And finally, perhaps the most important thing for understanding the Russian psychology is that it's only great powers that truly pursue independent foreign policies. It's the few great powers that determine the structure, the substance, and the direction of international affairs. So, for Russia, we think sovereign state, inevitable conflict, hard power, balance, and it's good to be a great power in Russia's world. And that's what Russia wants to be, one of those few great powers. And Putin would argue that from the moment that he became president over a dozen years ago, that he has sought to try to restore and sustain Russia as that great power, as a country of consequence in global affairs. And the question I think we want to ask tonight is that indeed so? And what are the challenges that Russia faces in order to sustain itself in that role? Now, I would argue today that there are 4 strategic challenges that Russia has to master if it's going to sustain itself as a great power over the years to come. And those are, it needs to reassert its primacy in the former Soviet space. It needs to balance between Europe and Asia and integrate into both of those. It needs to defend itself against the unrest from the Muslim South. And they need to harness American power to Russian purpose. Now, the sine qua non of mastering all these strategic challenges is recreating Russia as that dynamic core of Eurasia. Economically, this means that Russia needs to take on some form of modernization and diversification of its economy, to be able to compete across a broad sector of economic in the economy, and particularly those that are based on cutting-edge technologies. It needs to master the challenges of the information technological revolution. It needs to ease its reliance on commodities. It needs to rebuild and upgrade its infrastructure. It needs to bring its public health and public education sectors up to world-class standards. And this is all the more important now because Russia's population, 143 million now, is almost certainly going to shrink in decades to come. Now, the Russian leaders understand all of this. They talk about this constantly. Over the past several years, they have written program upon program that's supposed to deal with these very problems. The issue, however, has been that the Russians, and with Putin at the helm, have been unable to set a course and to execute it in a timely and efficient fashion. Putin himself has been extremely reluctant to take on the rent-seeking vested interests that benefit handsomely from current arrangements. And so the economy has entered a period now of stagnation. This doesn't mean that Russia isn't better off now than it was a decade ago. Certainly it is economically, but major challenges remain going forward. The same is true on the political side. And a big question in Russia today is what political changes are necessary to help modernize and diversify the economy and regain that dynamism. Now, there's lots of talk about what needs to be done. I would argue that the system has to open up to some extent. It has to provide space for the innovation, the creativity, the risk-taking that drive economies in the modern world. This doesn't mean that Russia has to turn into a liberal Western democracy. There are many ways short of that Russia could regain its dynamism. But certainly the authoritarian trend that Putin has pursued over the past year is not the way towards the future. Now, as we think about the next few years in Russian politics, I also think that there are three issues that we should focus on, three tasks that the Russian political system needs to accomplish. The first is that they need to co-opt the young urban professionals. This is the group that took to the streets after the rigged elections of the Duma in December of 2011. These are the IT savvy people, the people who make a government function and an economy function effectively. And therefore, these are the very people that are necessary if Putin is going to succeed in his own ambitions for Russia. So he needs to figure out a way to co-opt them. And what we may be seeing in recent weeks is an incipient change in the tactics from coercion to co-optation. In the most recent elections, regional elections in Russia in the beginning of September, they allowed a number of opposition figures, the asystemic opposition, to participate in elections. The most prominent case is Navalny in Moscow. An opening, a sense that these people were going to be able to participate in a broader political process. Now, whether this is going to pan out or not is too clear. It's premature to say at this point. We just think about Navalny, who's still facing a number of criminal cases at this very moment. So whether he's going to be able to continue to participate in the political process or not is unclear. Second, the Russians need to figure out how to engineer a generational change in leadership. All the key leaders in Russia today, starting with Putin, are really products of the Soviet period. This is true not only of the people in government, it's true of the opposition as well. Many of the key opposition leaders I met for the first time when I was in Moscow in the late 1980s, and they're still on the stage today. But these are people that are products of the Soviet period. They need to make way for this next generation of leaders, a set of leaders who have come of age in the new Russia, are better educated, feel more confident in dealing with the outside world, and are more in tune with the possibilities of the information technological revolution. And this needs to be done as smoothly and as quickly as possible. And in this regard, Putin's return to the Kremlin a year and a half ago set back this necessary evolution or change in generation in the Russian leadership. And the third challenge is Russia must find a way to deal with the growing ethnic Russian nationalism. An ethnic Russian nationalism that burst into violence on the outskirts of Moscow in the past couple of weeks. Russia, remember, has developed historically as a multi-ethnic country ruled by a multi-ethnic elite. Moreover, the basis of its geopolitical heft has been primacy in the surrounding non-Russian regions. And so in a way, ethnic Russian nationalism poses a threat both to the ruling elite and to Russia's position in the world. Now, so far, Putin has tried to manage this by appealing to traditional values, traditional Russian values as opposed to Western values, by promoting the Russian Orthodox Church, by asserting Russia on the international stage, and most recently by fueling anti-Americanism. The problem is discontent continues to grow. And so what we need to look at very closely over the next several months is how Putin tries to deal with this upsurge in ethnic Russian nationalism, how successfully he is in dealing with it, and that will tell us a lot about what Russia's identity is going to be going forward and what role it's going to play in the world. So, in short, much needs to be done to rebuild this dynamism. Beyond that, for each of the strategic challenges that I've mentioned, Russia needs to determine what the stakes are, what the obstacles to progress are, and what the best way forward for Russia are. Now let me start with the former Soviet space. Russia's position has been under threat for several years. China has penetrated commercially into Central Asia very rapidly over the past few years. Today, it is the leading commercial partner of 4 of the 5 Central Asian states, ahead of Russia. China has built oil and gas pipeline from the Caspian region across Central Asia into Chinese markets, circumventing Russian territory, and in that way eroding the control, the monopoly control that Russia once had over the export of energy out of Central Asia, which was a very important lever in controlling those countries and also in dealing with Europe. Radical Islam is very active in the North Caucasus. It threatens to penetrate into the strategically more important Muslim regions of Tatarstan and Bashkortostan, regions of Russia that sit on the lines of communication between European Russia and the Russian Far East. And even Europe, despite all the disarray, acts as a magnet, at least on Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. So Russia's position in the former Soviet space is under threat. And it's not surprising that for the past several years, Putin has tried aggressively to reassert Russia's primacy. He's done that through the aggressive use of economic levers. You think about the cutoff of gas to Ukraine, for example, as a way to try to bring Ukraine back into the Russian economic fold. He's encouraged Russian investment in the former Soviet space. And at the same time, he's also tried to build and invigorate institutions that help integrate the region. Think of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Customs Union. And a couple of years ago, Putin announced his desire to build what he called a Eurasian Union, along the lines of the European Union, a union that would ultimately bring in almost all the former Soviet space, minus the Baltics. But this project runs into 2 big problems. It's Ukraine and it's Uzbekistan. Absent those 2 states, Eurasian Union doesn't make economic or strategic sense. Ukraine is the former Soviet space, or the former Soviet country with the greatest economic potential after Russia itself. It is located in the strategically important region on the northern shore of the Black Sea, the gateway into Europe for Russia. Uzbekistan is the largest state by far in population in Central Asia, and it lies in the very heart of that region. And neither Ukraine nor Uzbekistan wants to be part of a Russian-dominated economic entity. We see that Ukraine is gravitating towards Europe. And if things go the way I think the Europeans hope and the Ukrainians hope, they will sign an association agreement in Vilnius at the end of this month. Uzbekistan continues to maneuver among the United States, Russia, and China in order to enhance its own political independence. And during the past 2 years, it has rebuilt its relationship with the United States, and for the second time, withdrawn from the Collective Security Treaty Organization. So major problems in rebuilding Russia's primacy in the former Soviet space. Now, beyond this space lie Europe and East Asia. The strategic zones that Russia must balance to advance its own geopolitical interest, and the 2 economic zones into which Russia needs to integrate in order to prosper itself. At the moment, Europe is by far the more important for Russia, and for many reasons. You remember that Peter the Great opened a window on Europe with the building of St. Petersburg at the beginning of the 18th century. Russia has followed the European trajectory towards greater political liberty over the past several hundred years. Granted, with a lag of about 100 years, but nevertheless in that direction. A theory that I think has been best described by an eminent historian who used to be here at Berkeley, Martin Malya. Russia demonstrated itself, its prowess as a great power on the great battlefields of Europe, in the great European diplomatic conferences, and in competition along its southern border with the great European powers, particularly Europe. So it thinks of itself as Europe, Russians as Europeans, Russia itself as part of Europe. What is also clear is that Russia is not Asia, and it's not going to be part of Asian civilization. Nevertheless, East Asia is an important entity for Russia as it tries to counterbalance its relationship with Europe, particularly in the area of trade. Today, about half of all of Russia's trade is with Europe. 75% of the cumulative foreign direct investment in Russia comes from European sources. By contrast, only about 20% of Russia's trade is with three of the most dynamic trading countries in East Asia: China, South Korea, and Japan. And as far as energy exports are concerned, almost 100% of Russian gas goes to European markets, 80% of its oil. By contrast, almost none goes to, no gas goes to Asian markets, and about 12% of the oil goes to Asian markets. So Russia needs to establish itself as an economic entity in this part of the world. I think that's the message that Putin wanted to send by hosting the APEC summit in Vladivostok last year. Now, it's also clear that at the center of this East Asian strategy is going to lie China. And Putin has put a great effort into rebuilding this relationship with China over the past dozen years. And he would argue, and I think he's right, that Sino-Russian relations now are better than they have been for at least the past 50 to 60 years. But China presents problems for Russia, and Putin is going to have to rebuild this relationship with great care. The Chinese, as we all know, look out after their own interests first. And they're not about to sign an energy deal, either gas or oil, at a price that's lower than what they can get, simply to curry favor with the Russians. And so the Russians are going to have to make sure that they develop their Far Eastern provinces in a way that these resources don't become captive to the Chinese markets. They need to reach out to other countries, particularly the United States, South Korea, and Japan, to ensure that the infrastructure is developed in a way that brings Russian resources to the Asia-Pacific region and not solely into Chinese markets. Beyond economic ties, Russia also has to think about the geopolitical aspects of this relationship between Europe and East Asia. China clearly provides Russia with something of a counterbalance to the United States. Certainly on the global level, we see the cooperation between Russia and China at the UN Security Council on a range of issues, most markedly in the Middle East over the past several years. And we also see the cooperation between Russia and China in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, intended, I think, quite clearly to constrain what the United States could do in Central Asia. But by the same token, the Russians need to develop a good relationship with Europe so that it can act as a hedge against what the Chinese might do over time in Eurasia, more broadly speaking, and also because a good relationship with Europe buys the Russians some leverage with the United States. Now, I think if you look at it from this perspective, you can make a good argument from the standpoint of Russia's own interest. It would be better off with a unified Europe than a Europe of multiple independent nation states. That's not the way Russia looks at it. The traditional Russian view has been one that prefers to deal with individual European states on their own, not as a collective. Russia made its way in the world in competition with these states, not in partnership with Europe in solving global problems. And you see that in every aspect of Russian policy toward Europe today. You look at energy, where the Russians have tried to undermine any effort by the Europeans to develop a common energy policy. They've worked with the Germans in particular as a way of undermining and gaining leverage over the Poles and the Balts. But we also see this in their approach to security issues, their desire to erode the role of NATO by making an argument in favor of equality in security arrangements, but it's equality between the various states of Europe, Russia included. So Russia is going to have to change that traditional view, I think, for its own purposes. And that is something that's going to take a tremendous amount of time. Now, compared to Europe and East Asia, the Muslim South is of much lesser importance to the Russians today. But there are two issues that they have to deal with. One is radical Islam, and the second is Afghanistan. Radical Islamic movements continue to gain power and influence in the North Caucasus. And as I said, they could also endanger the strategically more important provinces of Tatarstan and Bashkortostan. Despite Moscow's claims of victory in Chechnya a decade ago, radical Islam, the insurgencies, continue to flourish across the North Caucasus, particularly in the ethnically complex region of Dagestan. And this is an effort that feeds off of the fragile states, the corruption, the unemployment in that part of the world. And it's something that's going to continue without a much better policy over the next several years. At the same time, Russia has to deal with the growing unrest in the Arab world. Now, we're just at the beginning stages of what was 2 years ago the Arab Spring. I know what season we're in at this point, but we certainly have moved beyond, I think, the euphoria we had about a democratic wave in the Middle East to a more realistic and starker understanding of what's happening. My own view is that out of this unrest are going to emerge Islamic forces that are going to dominate the secular forces in coming years. And the only question for us is whether these Islamic forces are going to be moderate or extreme, more authoritarian or more democratic. And this is going to be a challenge for Russia because those Islamic forces will exercise influence not only on the North Caucasus, but more broadly on Central Asia, and begin to challenge Russia's position in the former Soviet space and inside Russia itself. And so Russia is going to have to figure out a way that it can protect its interest in dealing with this part of the world. And it almost certainly is going to have to do that in conjunction with the other great powers. Now, Syria could turn out to be an inflection point. Certainly the United States and Russia have not cooperated in this part of the world at the same level in well over a generation, probably well over 2 generations. The initial steps in the elimination of chemical weapons have been more or less positive, but we're at the beginning stages of this. How it will play itself out over time is widely unknown. And the one thing that we do know is that neither Russia nor the United States has reliable control over the people that they see as their clients in this part of the world, whether it be the Assad regime or the opposition forces. So again, a challenge that is going to continue and I think deepen over the next several years for Russia. With regard to Afghanistan, I think it's almost certain, and you get to disagree with me on this, but I don't think you will, that instability is going to grow when the United States withdraws its forces for all practical purposes at the end of 2014. I don't see an Afghan state or an Afghan national army that's going to be able to provide the security that's necessary to deal with the various insurgent groups, the Taliban in particular, the narco bosses, other regional warlords, not to speak of the outside powers, particularly Pakistan, that will be interfering in affairs in Afghanistan. So something needs to be done to stabilize Afghanistan. And Russia ought to be playing the lead in this. And it has an institution to do that with. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in fact, includes the states that you would need in order to develop a framework for stabilizing Afghanistan. It has China, Russia, and Uzbekistan as full members, Pakistan, Iran, and India as candidate members. But the problem is that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has shown no interest at all in dealing with Afghanistan as a regional issue, and particularly as long as the United States is engaged in Afghanistan. Again, something that's going to have to change if Russia is going to be able to advance and defend its interest in that part of the world in the years ahead. Finally, let me say a few words about Russia and the United States. If you read through Russia's national security documents, if you listen to what Putin says, you would come away with the impression that the Russians see the United States as the gravest threat to their international position. In the Russian view, the United States wants to build a unipolar world. And by definition, in a unipolar world, Russia is not a great power. It's one of those other mediocre powers that pays homage to the United States. And it believes that the United States, for the past decade and longer, has pursued a set of policies, whether explicitly or implicitly, policies aimed at undermining Russia and containing it within the former Soviet space. Now, I think this view no longer makes sense. The Russia, or the United States that Russia confronts now, is radically different from the one that it faced when Putin rose to power over a dozen years ago. We're not coming off of the longest economic expansion in American history. We're still trying to deal with the vulnerabilities that have been exposed by the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. We may remain the preeminent power, but our preeminence, our margin of superiority is narrowing and has narrowed rapidly over the past decade, particularly vis-a-vis China. We're no longer in an expansionary mood. If anything, the United States and the public in particular is intent on retrenching. And most important from the standpoint of Russia, the United States is not flowing into the strategic vacuum that was created by the breakup of the Soviet Union and the waning of Russian power in that first decade after the breakup of the Soviet Union. If anything, the United States is slowly withdrawing from Central Asia and the Caucasus. So the situation, I would argue, is much different, and it creates the basis for cooperation, or more cooperation between Russia and the United States. Every American administration since the breakup of the Soviet Union has said that it is not interested in a weak Russia. Now, we all had doubts about how strong we wanted Russia to be, but it's clear we didn't want a weak Russia. And I think, ironically, contrary to what the Russians think at this point, their own national interests are served not by a weaker America, but by a stronger America. Not by America that withdraws, but by an America that remains engaged in global affairs. And the reason for this is straightforward. The United States is a factor in all of the strategic challenges that Russia faces. In all those regions that I've mentioned, Russia comes up against the United States. And if it organized its relationship with the United States properly, it could do this in ways that enhanced its security and advanced its geopolitical interest. We can help them manage the relationship with China, but in a way that doesn't undo the positive aspects of that relationship. The United States, I would argue, is critical over the long run to any type of security structure that's put in place along Russia's southern reaches, from Afghanistan into the Middle East. And even with regard to Europe, the United States can play an important role in helping to restructure the security of Europe in a way that creates three poles: a united Europe, flanked by the United States and Russia. And as hard as it might be to believe in Moscow, I think the United States can play a role in helping Russia maintain its presence in the former Soviet space, in part because, contrary to, I think, the thinking of Washington, I think America has an interest in Russia being present in that region, again, given what the alternatives might be over the next generation and beyond. But to do that, we're going to have a different type of relationship with Russia. In particular, the Russians and the Kremlin are going to have to move back and away from the anti-Americanism that they have been fanning over the past several years, a step that they don't appear ready to take at this point. Now, I could end my lecture here, and maybe I should.
That's your call. I mean, we don't want to hear 30 more minutes of lecture.
But you know, this is an academic setting, and
Yes,
when
it
I
is.
gave you the title and I said, "Where is Putin taking Russia?" you said that wasn't good enough.
I did.
There had to be a colon, and there had to be a second phrase.
Implications.
And so there has to be something about implications for U.S. policy. So let me do that, and I can do this very, yes.
Thank you very much.
So I can do this very, very quickly. Russia is a very prickly power for us to deal with. It's a mix of vulnerabilities and challenges. It has an ambition to play a role in the world that lies beyond its capabilities at this point. And there's certainly a strong desire, I would argue, in Washington, simply not to deal with Russia. The president has talked about a pause with Russia. Now, that was before Syria. But the problem is that we can't ignore Russia. On almost every key foreign policy issue, Russia shows up, whether it's nonproliferation, counterterrorism, regional security in Europe and Asia, the broader Middle East, whether it's energy security, and a host of non-traditional, it's not just security challenges. So we're going to have to figure out a way to deal with Russia. Now, the two things that are important as we try to structure a policy. One is that Russia is no longer a strategic rival to the United States. It doesn't pose a strategic threat. And second, our ability to manage this relationship, our ability to act internationally, is light years ahead of where the Russians are. And we should have the dominant position in any relationship with Russia. So the question is, how do we proceed? The first is the obvious point. We really need to get our own house in order. We need to rebuild some respect for American power and America's competence. And certainly the way that we've handled a range of foreign policy issues, not to speak of domestic issues in the past couple of years, has not inspired either fear or awe or respect in Moscow. I was in Moscow a couple of weeks ago, probably for the 3 or 4 most difficult days in my life, trying to explain to Russians I've known for 20 or 25 years what the essence of American policy towards Syria was, and why all of this was flowing out in a way that made strategic sense for the United States. It made me understand the way the Russians felt in the 1990s when they tried to explain what was happening inside their country. It's not a position that most Americans, and certainly Americans who have worked in the U.S. government, want to find themselves in abroad, and certainly not in Moscow. The second is that we need to acknowledge the differences in interests and priorities between the United States and Russia. I would go so far to say that on almost every major international issue today, Russia and the United States are, if not on opposite sides, at least in different places. Best example is Iran. How often have we heard that we share an interest in preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon? I think it's clearly true at some level. I've heard it coming from Putin himself years ago. The problem is that preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon lies at the very top of our list of priorities. If you look at Russian national security documents, non-proliferation Iran is at best somewhere down 6th and 7th. The second is when we think about Iran, we see two very different countries. What's Iran to most Americans? Not only is it an aspiring nuclear weapons state, but it's a state that destabilizes the Persian Gulf region. It's a state that supports international terrorism. It's a state that oppresses its own people. When the Russians look at Iran, they see a country that is an important neighbor, a country that has pursued a set of policies in Central Asia and the Caucasus that have been sensitive to Russian national interests. And it's also a country, and one of the few countries in the world, that has enough gas that if relations were ever normalized between the United States and Iran, between Europe and Iran, that gas would move into European markets and challenge Russia's dominance, particularly in Eastern Europe. So when the United States wants what we would call crippling sanctions against Iran to make them back away from their nuclear weapons program, the Russians say, not so fast. They don't want to gratuitously harm relations with a country that is an important neighbor and at some level a friendly neighbor as far as Russia is concerned. And I think you make a similar argument about almost every other policy that's at the top of our agenda, whether it be strategic arms reductions, Afghanistan, what's happening in the Middle East at this point, and so on. And so we talk about shared interest. We need to look at the details, and I think we find that the interests aren't nearly as well shared as we thought they were. And what this means is that the relationship with Russia is going to be transactional. We need to think in terms of trade-offs, of quid pro quos, always from the standpoint of whether the cost is less than the benefit from the standpoint of American national interest. And this, in fact, is the way that the Obama administration initially pursued the reset, no matter how often they deny that in public. So the decision to redo the missile defense architecture in Europe, the decision to downgrade relations with Georgia and Ukraine, the decision to be more moderate in the criticism of Russian domestic politics was all done in the hopes that Russia would respond in a positive way. And in fact, in the way that Russia did respond, by agreeing to the New START, by agreeing to a first set of sanctions against Iran, by agreeing to support the northern distribution route that supplies American forces in NATO, and by abstaining from the resolution on Libya a couple of years ago. The problem is that the transactional approach has reached its limits, or becomes harder to do as the issues that are on the table hew closer to the core interest of both countries. So transactional, but it's much more difficult to do that at this point. The third aspect is to remember that despite these differences, the United States and Russia still can cooperate on a range of issues that are much more narrowly defined and clearly bring benefits to both countries. So we've done a little bit of this in counterterrorism, we've done this in counter-narcotics. We've worked together quite capably in repatriating highly enriched uranium from research reactors abroad back into Russia for reprocessing there. The problem is that despite all the benefits we get from this type of cooperation, the cumulative impact is not significant on the overall relationship, certainly not in the short term. If you extend this out over 5, 10, 15 years perhaps, but it's not going to make a radical change in the way the two countries pursue the relationship today. The fourth and last point I would make is that what we really need to do, what the real challenge in U.S.-Russian relations today, is to find that new agenda. The agenda for the relationship today is really an amalgam of legacy issues and current crises. It's not future-oriented. It looks towards the past and the present. And the question is whether the two countries can find a way to focus on the future. We all know that we're in a period of tremendous turmoil, of flux, a period in which an old order has been eroded and a new international order of some kind will gradually take shape over the next decade or beyond. And the United States needs to sit down with Russia and ask how the changes that we can see will impact on the national interest of both countries. What each country might be able to do to help the other country deal with its strategic issues. And if this is done in an appropriate fashion, we may be able to develop a future-looking strategic framework for cooperation that would begin to have some positive impact on the relationship today. Now, we're not doing that. And it's unfortunate that we're not doing it, because we really are at a critical moment in international affairs. We're probably facing one of the most challenging decades in recent history. A new international order will emerge. There are going to be surprises along the way. For Russia, I think the consequences can be greater, because it does have to master those challenges. It does have to build the resources in order to do that. And it's far from certain that they're going to be able to do that. The challenges for the United States are more one of political imagination and political will at this point. With regard to Russia, the question is whether we can build a relationship with Russia that advances American national interest. Now, this has never been an easy task, and the one thing I know from having dealt with Russia over the past 20 years is it's not going to get any easier over the next several years.
Tom, thank you very much.
right at the bell, too.
This is Tom's first visit to Berkeley, and after that sweeping and very insightful talk, we look forward to, I hope, many return visits. So thank you very much for that visit. We're have half an hour or so. I also want to say that at the end of the question and answer session, we'll have a small reception. We'll have some wine and cheese so people can talk among themselves about Tom's presentation or about other issues. And
they can also talk to me if they want.
And also talk to Tom more directly about his comments today. So with that said, let me open the floor. I'm not sure whether, we're very pleased that Dean George Breslauer is here, but I'm not sure whether you, I offer you the first question if you'd like, otherwise I'll go elsewhere on the floor.
Okay.
Now I have this Potemkin mic. I'm not sure if we really need it, but I will continue to use it as a prop if for no other reason than that we have it. Should I hand it around, or can you take questions from the floor? Okay, I will do so. So please use the mic.
You began your presentation by alluding to the fact that the perspective in Moscow is shaped principally by a balance of power realist notion, and that in Washington, other than deadlock, it's a combination of conflict between liberal interventionism and what you called conservatism. And I'm wondering to what extent, when you went through this panorama of difficult relations between the United States and Russia in different parts of the world over different types of issues, the conflict is a product of the clash between those two sets of perspectives, or simply a product of the U.S. in balance of power terms defining its interests differently from the way Russia does?
I don't need that, right?
No, you
I mean, it's a very good question. I think, part of it is the problems have, in fact, grown out of the imbalance of power between the two countries, particularly in the first decade after the breakup of the Soviet Union, when in many ways the United States continued to pursue what I would have called very much a Cold War type of policy, absent the other superpower, and it pushed us forward into regions that were once controlled out of Moscow, without a great deal of thought as to what the long-term consequences of that type of advance by the United States would be. We later reformulated that, and I think in the late Clinton administration and the Bush administration, more as an effort to advance democracy. And it certainly became a major point in the Bush administration when we talked about the freedom agenda, which was supposed to deal with terrorism initially, but then was expanded to include, I think, the overall thrust of American foreign policy. So there was that imbalance in power. Now, it does come from two very different types of ideologies as well. Now, I don't think that the liberal interventionists and the neoconservatives are really all that far apart when it comes to to foreign policy. The difference is not whether the United States should aggressively advance democracy in the world. It's more about the means you go about doing that. With the neoconservatives tending more towards the use of military force, not necessarily as a last resort, but one of those tools in the arsenal that you can use. The liberal interventionist sort of tending towards sort of multilateral approaches and through the UN. But at the end of the day, if you look at who supported the intervention in Iraq, it was both the liberal interventions and the neoconservatives. It's the realist that would have said, let's take a step back and make see whether this is really in our interest. The Russians saw this clearly from their own balance of power standpoint, which was a powerful country asserting its sway in regions that were close to Russia, using ideology as a smokescreen, as Putin has said, as more than one occasion to advance their geopolitical goals, talking about counterterrorism, but really wanting again to use that as not so much a way of cooperating with Russia, but as a way of undermining Russia in its own backyard. So, I mean, the short answer is it's a combination of the two. If I were to say which was more important, I think it really was the imbalance of power that drove the United States forward in a way that put it on Russia's doorsteps very, very rapidly, and looked from the Russian standpoint as a long-term strategic goal to maintain the U.S. presence there, constrain Russia, and prevent it from ever reaching the dimensions in terms of either geographical reach or power that it had not only as the Soviet Union, but earlier than that as the Russian Empire.
And if that's could I ask you to identify yourself with the group just when you...
Ned Walker from the Program in Eurasian and East European Studies. Your last comments make for a nice segue to my question, which is, it strikes me that there's no more difficult or dangerous an issue in U.S.-Russian relations than the future of Ukraine. And so my question for you is, should the United States be supporting what's going to happen in Vilnius? Should we be pushing accession for Ukraine and supporting it to the EU? And above all, what about NATO? And what do we do in the long run about what in effect is a kind of an invitation at some point to Ukraine to join NATO, which I believe is something that the Russians are just fundamentally opposed to?
Let me take it from the back, because the NATO question is the easy one. I think the short answer from my standpoint is no. I see no reason to bring Ukraine into NATO as a member. I don't see what strategic sense it makes from the standpoint of NATO's own mission, how it helps stabilize Europe. And you're absolutely correct, it's something that the Russians won't abide by. And if we think we had problems with the way the Russians dealt with Georgia in 2008, I think Ukraine would be a whole different kettle of fish. EU economic is, I think, a more difficult issue. And I think the solution to this really is a broader type of arrangement that in fact bring Russia closer to Europe in terms of trade, as you're bringing the Ukrainians along at the same time. Now, the Russians will never be part of the European Union. I think their size, their geography, I think in their own sort of sense of who they are as a nation precludes that. But if you did that, I think it eases some of the concerns that they would have about a closer commercial tie between Ukraine and the European Union, up to and including membership. The important thing from the Russian standpoint, I would believe, is that Russia not lose access to that market. And that's one of the things that they are concerned about now. If Ukraine does draw closer to the EU, are barriers put up in a way that has a negative consequence for their own economic future. So I think there are ways of managing that if you had enough imagination in both Brussels and Moscow. That's a big if. Second thing I would make is I think the European Union has, in a sense, pursued this in a way that is needlessly provocative from the Russian standpoint. I think there's nothing wrong with the European Union building ties to the former Soviet states. I think it was a mistake to call it an Eastern Partnership and create a region that was clearly non-Russian, that Russia had a significant interest in, and then make the argument that you're trying to draw this all closer to the EU. The obvious question from the Russian standpoint, into the EU and away from whom? So I think it was handled improperly with a little bit more finesse, and I think a different sort of set of policies towards the Russians. I think you can use that concern. NATO, there's no way of doing that. I don't think it makes any sense. Ukraine should be, for all practical purposes, a neutral country. We need to work out the relationship between the United States, Europe, and Russia first, and then I think Ukraine falls into that structure in some appropriate way. But if you work out the relationship between those three first, I think you take away a lot of the concern that Russia has about Ukraine's security arrangements.
On the implications, there's one that you're not even talking about. Oh, I'm Michael. I'm just from the public. On the implications, there's one that you haven't even talked about, is the implication of, I think Putin really wants to be in the OPEC and have a great relationship with Saudi Arabia to control the oil markets, because right now they need $110 oil to sustain their economy. With all the blunders of this administration, with the Syria, with not supporting, the Iranian deal with Israel, and now Saudi Arabia now saying we're looking for another partner, and et cetera. I think the door's just been open for having another OPEC of more power. While we have a glut of oil, everybody thinks that things are going to be dandy, but I think sooner or later, this issue, we've just opened the Pandora box, and I don't know if I'm correct or not, but Putin's going to take advantage of this.
An interesting question. The Russians have thought about this for a long time, and they've always come to the conclusion that they don't want to be part of OPEC. They don't want to feel that they're under any obligation to coordinate their own energy policy, and certainly their oil policy, with a bunch of states that are run by radical Islamists, they might argue. They are trying to draw closer to the Saudis at this point, but I think that's more from a geopolitical standpoint than it is from an energy standpoint. It will allow them to play a larger role in the region than they have over the past couple of generations. But again, if you think about OPEC, one of the questions will be, what is the future of OPEC? Particularly given what's happening in the Middle East at this point. The Saudis and the Iranians are both key members of OPEC. The Iraqis are part of this as well, and they don't seem to be getting along all that well in recent times. So you have first, I think, the large question of whether OPEC itself can hold together as a...
But if they just become really close, like we are with Saudi Arabia, they can control the oil markets. But to some point, to keep that price of $100 or more.
Yeah, maybe yes, maybe no. I mean, the other interesting aspect of this is that the Russians going forward will need to develop oil resources that are in regions that are climatically much more difficult, geologically much more difficult. And for better or worse, they don't have either the technology or the management skills to do that at this point. And there are only a few places that you can go in order to get those skills and that technology, and all of them happen to be located in the West. So I think it's a much more complicated relationship than that. And again, I think Russia has a different set of concerns from most of the OPEC members, and it wants to play a role in the world that's somewhat different. So I see a lot of obstacles to their joining, and it wouldn't be at the top of my list of things that I would worry about at this point.
My name is James Shin. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. I have a question about the cultural, I don't want to go to the Huntington thesis of clash of civilizations, but the cultural divide, which I see in some ways between Russia and the West. And certainly over the last 2 centuries, Russians have had good reasons to be suspicious of the West, whether we talk about Napoleon or Hitler or what have you. But recently, the divide between our cultures on particularly social questions, as you see the polling numbers, for example, on things like homosexuality in Russia and compare it with attitudes in Western Europe and the United States, and the fact that the Russians seem to have this suspicion of the West. I mean, we would think that why doesn't Russia just want to become more like us, more like Western Europe, more flourishing, more everything? And yet they don't. I mean, they seem to have a suspicion about the West, which in some ways is comparable to the attitude in the Islamic world, that there are things about the West that they don't like, and that this seems to be growing. So I wondered if you could comment on that aspect of the relationship.
The relationship between the West and Russia has always been a complicated one. I mean, it isn't something that emerged in the past decade. You can go back centuries and talk about that. Western attitudes towards Russia have gone from sort of euphoria over what's happening in Russia to condemnation of what's happening. You see that in the way the United States has dealt with Russia over the past century. So this is not a new problem. I could always fall back on what Martin Malia wrote. It's a lag of 100 years. So we're 2013 and the Russians are 1913. So where were our attitudes on the social issues you raised in 1913? Are they radically different from where the Russians are today? I do think that there is a large segment, I think the dominant segment of the Russian elite, that would like to become part of Europe. They think of themselves as part of European civilization. But they also want that to be coupled with respect for sort of the special role that they have, that they play in world affairs. So it's a difficult relationship. What I would say about the current period is, I'm not so sure that it's Russia lagging behind as much as we've moved rapidly forward. The issues that we bring up in dealings with Russia on social issues. Now think of where we were even 10, 15, 20 years ago in the United States. There's been a rapid change here for various reasons, and you can see for a confluence of economic and social reasons, political reasons, why it's accelerated in the past couple of years. I think overwhelmingly a positive development in our societies, but that's not where we were 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. So I think when you deal with the Russians, we think about the Russians, you do have to give them some space. These were very difficult issues for us to resolve within our own society, and there's still debates still continue. Why do we believe that the Russians, who haven't advanced from our standpoint as far in these issues, would all of a sudden adopt these practices overnight? It's going to take a lot longer for that to happen in a complicated society like Russia. And this gets to, I think, sort of one of the broader problems we have in dealing with Russia on both social issues and political issues, is that we want Russia to meet the standards that we've set for ourselves today, forgetting that we've taken a long journey to get to these standards. It's what I call sort of the disadvantage of backwardness on political issues. We developed to the type of democracy that we are today through a whole host of conflicts and debates that played itself out over generations. But now we've got a standard for what it means to be democratic. And we apply that to countries that haven't had that time, that come from a different history. And we do it with a great deal of impatience. I think there are ways of expressing the concern that also, I think, in a sense, demonstrates respect for these societies, that it will take time, that they have to work this out on their own terms, and that leads for a better atmosphere in which we can work out the overall relationship, but which we can also discuss these issues. So I'm not as concerned about where Russia is headed. I think eventually they'll get there. The problem is that when they get there, we'll be someplace else.
Yes, Leonid Keel, Political Science. One of the dominant convictions in Russian intellectual as well as public debates over foreign policy and Russia's place in the world today proceeds from two sort of observable principles or perhaps convictions. One is that somehow the conviction is that the West, or the United States, the American hegemony in the world, and the European community is somehow in decline, perhaps irreversible decline. It's a matter of time, and it's a matter of style in which this decline is going to proceed further. And the second conviction is that somehow, and there's perhaps some historical foundation for it, a declining hegemon is unlikely to welcome the process of its own diminution, and is going to try to somehow retard the process, perhaps even reverse it. And so Russians, as a result of it, see the situation as essentially providing Russia as great power with an increased space for maneuver. The declining West, the declining United States, declining Europe, economically, militarily perhaps also, are increasing the space for maneuver, for Russia's own position in the world order. And so a great deal of this debate centers now around the question of what should be Russia's reaction to this process that they're convinced is going on. Should Russia somehow play along, in other words, use the diminution of American power to its own advantage? Should it be selective about in what area to try to expedite this process, to try to retard this process? And so my question to you with regard to this is, do you think, and to what extent do you think, Russia is likely, the Russian regime is likely to pursue a policy of calculated spoilership, perhaps, observing the vulnerabilities, carefully calculating the vulnerabilities, carefully calculating Russia's reaction and the implication of these vulnerabilities for Russian domestic and foreign policy? And to what extent do you think Russia is going to carefully use these vulnerabilities to gradually increase its own, expand its own space of maneuver in foreign policy?
You know, what you said sounds a lot like the intellectual debate in Washington 25 years ago when we were thinking about the Soviet Union declining and how we would deal with that. Look, certainly people in Russia are thinking along those terms. The question is whether they understand satisfactorily their own situation and can deal with this problem in a creative way that it enhances Russia's position in the world. I think a lot of what you're seeing is, in a sense, a reaction against what they saw as a Western policy that aimed at undermining Russia for the 2 decades after the breakup of the Soviet Union. But I think the question you have to ask, if they're trying to do that, how successful have they been up to this point? The Russians focus on the threat that the United States posed to their position in Central Asia, while the Chinese are eating Russia's lunch in Central Asia at this point. Certainly on the commercial side, at what point that translates from sort of a commercial presence to a security presence, the way how the economy is developed, where they look for their own outlets over the longer term is a big question at this point. If the Russians are exploiting European decline and American decline and disarray, it's hard to prove that by the way they've dealt with Ukraine and where the Ukrainians are tending at this point. So, one of the remarkable things about Russia today, as it looks at what it sees as a Europe in disarray and an American decline, is how few friends it really has in the world, and which powers or which neighboring states is it actually attracting, and which through its set of policies is it in fact pushing away. I'm pretty hard pressed to come up with a country that is being attracted toward Moscow at this point. The Middle East, obviously, I think, is an area where the Russians would like to reassert some influence. I think they see Syria as an opening. They believe that the United States is misplaying its hand, and that many of the countries that were close to the United States, Egypt, the Saudis, and others, are beginning to at least look towards Moscow, ask some questions in Moscow to see what role the Russians might play in that region. But then I think the question that you'd have to answer, and the question that Moscow would have to answer, is what do the Russians actually have to offer? They can sell weapons to Assad, but if the situation in Syria is ever resolved, and there is a transitional government, my guess is that the Syrians won't be buying conventional weapons from the Russians anymore. This is one of the big challenges on Iran. If Iran were to normalize relations with the United States and with Europe, we would be, the French companies would be building nuclear reactors in Iran, and we'd be selling them the conventional weapons and buying their oil and gas. So again, I think Russia's in a much more difficult spot. They look at the decline, and they see this perhaps as a ray of hope, sort of a repeat of what happened to them, only with them playing the upper hand at this point. When you step back and say, so how do you actualize that? What resources do you draw on in order to do this? I think that's a much more difficult problem. And then you come back to what I talked about earlier in my remarks. It's the economy, the modernization, the diversification, the development of a truly competitive economy that produces things other than natural resources that people want, and a political system that can effectively mobilize the resources of the country for national purposes. And absent that, what you're going to get is a lot of rhetoric and a lot of good discussions over vodka late at night, but I think little in the sense of a practical policy that begins to change begins to change in a radical way the perception of Russia and the role that Russia plays in the world.
Your comment about vodka reminds me that we have a reception in just a couple of minutes with some wine and cheese, but I'll take one more
no
question
vodka, right?
before we break, and then we can continue more informally in that setting.
Thank you. Peter Dumont. I'm a graduate in Peace and Conflict Studies from this institution and a leader of the Star Alliance Foundation for All, a nonprofit organization. You mentioned the importance of finding the new agenda, or a bold new agenda, if I could add that word, for U.S.-Russian cooperation. And maybe you know the wag who said, only the right can implement the policies of the left. And I'd like to apply that to only the 5 United Nations veto holders, the real power brokers in the current universal system, can provide the effective leadership to create a truly democratic United Nations with a charter review process, and which would constitute a global constitutional convention. So I'm in the process of responding to President Putin's op-ed in the New York Times. I saw it as an opportunity to be a citizen and say thank you very much, and here's one man's response and one organization's response. And I'd like to propose that kind of bold leadership and to get away just from the dominance of the sovereign state only, that we just have to get over that. And what do you think of that? Could you respond? And
No, 30 seconds is easy. One of the few things the P5 agree on is that they don't want the system to be reformed. I said one of the few things the P5, that is the permanent members of the UN Security Council, agree on is that they don't want the system to be reformed. And Russia, I think, first of all, because the problem for Russia builds off the response to the second question. If you're going to reorder the UN, if you're going to rethink the Security Council, and you're going to rethink the veto, is Russia going to be better off than it is now or not? And give me the scenario under which Russia is better off. Now, you can make the argument on better world, this, that, and the other thing. I don't think that's where the Russians are. The question the Russians will ask is, do we have a seat at the table? Do our interests have to be taken into account? And can we thwart things through our veto when we don't like it? And the answer is going to be no. If you were to sort of reform the UN Security Council at this point, would you have a veto at all? And if you had a veto, which countries would have a veto? So I look at it, Russia wouldn't be on my list. I can think of a couple of countries that I might put on the list, but it wouldn't be.
I don't want to put words in Tom's mouth, but he's particularly well suited to answer a question about the United Nations. When I invited him to come here, I was hoping for a twofer, because Tom's wife is currently, and has been for 4 years, the deputy permanent representative at the United Nations, working first under Susan Rice and now under Samantha Power. So I suspect when Rosemary comes home and the two of you talk, you're getting insights about the United Nations that the rest of us benefit from hearing. But with that said, let's adjourn.
But I'm not supposed to tell anybody about it.
With that said, let's adjourn. Thank Tom and have a bit of a reception.